Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where therapists can talk about their mental health journeys and how they manage to navigate mental wellness in their own lives. This week, I have a very special guest. I'm joined by Erica Lima. Erica, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I'm so thankful to be here and to be a part of the podcast.
Yeah, awesome. My starting off question has kind of turned into what got you into the mental health field? Like, what was that journey for you? Did you know you wanted to do it? Was it trial and error? Kind of tell us how you got into the field.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I am in the field of social work, so I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And I'm in private practice now, but actually didn't start out that way. I would say probably a big part of me that kind of led to my journey into the more kind of social work and aware of social issues did have to come from the environment that I was raised in, being in a very kind of religious upbringing, highly controlled environment. So there was that kind of sensitivity towards social issues and problems in the world and things that I was very like attentive and sensitive to. So I would say that it definitely started pretty young, my awareness of some of like the inequalities in the world and like my, anger and discomfort around that. So I would say that was like a big part that did kind of shape me in a positive way in terms of my interest and passion and wanting to be able to kind of level the playing field and for people to be able to get some of the support that they needed. I think on the flip side of that, right, there was also just, I think coming from that very, excuse me, coming from a very kind of highly controlled religious upbringing, there was a lot of misuse of power, right? So that was kind of a big part of not only within the church, but also at home, right? Like there was a lot that was happening around this kind of misuse of power. So again, I would say kind of like my sensitivity to that, and then also kind of being a woman, right, in some of these spaces, right? And kind of seeing some of like a patriarchy and sexism that's kind of playing out. So I think that really kind of started that course of, okay, I really wanted to go into social work and I wanted to kind of fight for the rights of the people, right? So that was a big start of it. Interesting enough, I actually never saw myself going into therapy or private practice. I was like, I'm going to do the hard work in the trenches. I'm going to be with the people.
Yeah.
Right. So, which in some sense, I had a lot of experience, right? I've worked in residential treatment centers, people with substance use disorders, people with severe mental illness. I've worked kind of on the Native American reservations, kind of supporting the tribes. So I've done like a wide different kind of range of social worky stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
And now here I am in private practice. And so I think some of that kind of leading up to that, like obviously we work in this kind of environment that it is really easy for social workers to get burnt out and they're under supported and under resourced. So I did kind of a pivot to be able to really be able to support people on a different level of like, okay, I want to actually kind of help with the more kind of culture of mental health and being able to support people as they're working through different issues around trauma. And I think being able to kind of put some of the words to my own story and understand some of the religious trauma, which really isn't a topic that's talked about very much in our society. So that was kind of like, I would say that was kind of the movement that started happening for me.
Sure. So you went to school straight for social work? Like that was your early passion of like social injustice and things, the patriarchy and some of these other things that you saw firsthand. You were like, all right, social work, that's what I want to do. Okay. I'm always curious when I talk to other people coming from religious backgrounds, what was like the messaging you got in your childhood around mental health?
Yeah, well, another really great question because I mean, I think a big part of it was that you're not allowed to have needs, right? And having needs is selfish.
Hmm.
And so that was just like, I feel like at every turn that you would make, every decision that you would make, right? A lot of it kind of came back to, okay, if you make that decision, or if you do that for yourself, or if it's not for like God's glory, right? Quotation, quotation.
Yeah. Right.
um, then it's selfish, and also it's punishable, right? Or it's sinful.
Yeah.
So I think that is like a really big, and I see that even in the work that I do with clients now, that it keeps coming up, right? Okay, I have all these needs, but then again, I can't acknowledge them, or it's not okay for me to have them, right?
Yeah.
Or even I have to cut myself off from some of these needs that I have. Which again, I was just kind of reflecting and just kind of processing, right, writing about some of these issues that I work with clients and all of that. And that was one that kind of keeps coming up, right? Is
Yeah.
in some of these spaces, right? We're also taught to cut ourselves off from some of these like biological needs that we have, right?
Right.
Whether it's like, okay, these are emotional needs, these are sexual needs that we have. This is, I need to take a break, I need to sleep, right?
Yeah.
And then we get so conditioned and so trained that we have to like cut ourselves off from that. And that's a very like violent act, to be
Yeah.
like, no, I'm not allowed to have that. And then you have that on a chronic way, right? Again and
Yeah.
again and again. And especially
Yeah.
from people in positions of power. So I would say that's like a big one that I noticed that comes up for people a lot. That's come up for myself as well. Just this kind of like denial of needs, or if you do, that's like incredibly selfish.
Yeah. I grew up fundamentalist, not that we called ourselves fundamentalist, but evangelical Christian. And there was this always kind of this idea of like God first, then the church, and then your family. And like that's where the list ended. Like you as an individual were never even on the list. So yeah, I totally get kind of what you're talking about with cutting yourself off. I think the selfishness and then like the shame that goes a lot with religious upbringing of like prioritizing yourself or taking care of yourself is selfish, and then you're supposed to feel shame over that. So like this idea that you need something or you want something is shameful. And like I
Mm.
think that's so damaging for people, especially as they're growing up, because a lot of these things are natural and healthy, and then you're getting like it's sin or you're going to hell for that or whatever it is. And like I know for me, health trauma was like a really big sticking point. I was a very imaginative child, and if you told me that I was going to a lake of fire for forever, like that stuck. So I think that's something that's really fascinating, and kind of like seeing that as a trauma, um, and understanding that that reshapes your brain, and your brain has to process things differently because it doesn't feel safe versus the safety of like, oh, that's natural and healthy. And like, how do we support that? How do we get your needs met?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it can really call, and this is another thing that you're probably familiar with as well, but even just how like mental health and mental health issues for people who grow up in really religious environments, like it's not talked about. There's this
Mhm.
complete denial that it exists, right? Or there's like blaming the person that they have it, right?
Yeah.
So again, they're being totally like cut off from the support that they need, access to resources. That was another big part of kind of my story is I was completely sheltered, completely cut off from the outside world, right? So there was this like restricting of being able to even get support or resources, like that wasn't even allowed because all of this was controlled. What was coming in, what you're watching, what everything was controlled.
Yeah.
So again, I think that's like a really big piece, like for people who are able to start talking about these things and being able to come out of it, is to actually say like, oh my gosh, like it's okay that I need support. It's okay that I have these needs. Like, and even the act of talking about it can be, can trigger a whole kind of like trauma response, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like, oh, something bad gonna happen. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, then I
Yeah.
think it messes with what healthy boundaries should look like, because you're taking on so much of what if it makes this person look bad or it makes the church look bad, and the church, organized religion in general, I would say most, if not all of them, have this idea of like they're putting their forward-facing persona or their kind of identity in front of any member. So it's like, oh, that makes the church look bad. We're not going to let that get out. We're going to hush hush, like shame on you for having a problem with it. And like, that's so unhealthy for people who, especially people who have been wronged in some way.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. That whole power dynamic again is another piece. And so even in therapy, right, that's something that have to be super sensitive to as a therapist, right? Because I'm in a position of power, right? And so
Right.
if people are coming in with this history of so much trauma or abuse around people in positions of power, like how can we kind of like create a space in therapy that even feels safe enough for people to be able to kind of open up or talk about things and to not feel like that power dynamic so much.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think that's something that I deal with a lot because I'm cis het white male. Like it's one of those things where like, oh yeah, like some people I think it's comfortable in a way, but as a therapist, then I have to be aware of like that comfort might not be helpful for them long term or sustainable. It probably came from a pretty unhealthy place to just think, oh, this person is the default authority. And I think sometimes therapy can be really freeing, but also some people get scared away from therapy because it's just so different.
It's very true.
So going back into your history a little bit, you did the social work stuff. Was there a point where you felt burnt out? Is that kind of the push to private practice, or was it just kind of as your life experience changed and grew over time, so did your kind of professional interests, or what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was kind of a combination of both. I think there was a really big issue kind of around the burnout and also just the bureaucracy of it, right? Like working in some of these social systems, right? And then not like it's incredibly frustrating to not be able to really provide some of the services that the people actually need or to
Yeah.
get caught up doing documentation, or it's like we're fighting for funding and like we have to tell people no for this and this reasons, and like it's just a mess. So I feel
Yeah.
like there's definitely that aspect of you feel like kind of you're spinning your wheels. Like, am I actually helping people in some of these systems that are not being revamped, that are not being re-envisioned and reformed, right? Um, so there was definitely some like anger and frustration and having done the community mental health thing for so long. Um, and I think there was also this kind of visionary piece of like, maybe I can do this a little bit differently. Maybe I can like think a little bit differently about ways that I want to kind of support people, shifting cultures for people to be able to actually kind of name some of these taboos, to be able to talk through things. Um, and then I had my own kids. So I
Yeah.
think that was another kind of push for myself that was kind of this wake up call. Like, I cannot keep like running myself into the ground, kind of like trying to support these people in a system that doesn't support or care about them.
Yeah.
Right. And then you end up in all these kind of like battles with higher management and all of that.
Yeah.
So I think that was a big part of me kind of having to take that step back and to kind of ask some of those hard questions of like, okay, what do I want for myself? What's important for me? Like, what kind of legacy do I want to be living if I'm like super burnout and kind of caught in some of these systems? So for me, kind of being able to kind of create my own practice to be able to I have like a lower caseload so that I can actually really support the people that I'm working with. And I
Sure.
tell them that, right? Like I'm here for you so that I can really invest my time and energy to support you in this journey.
Yeah.
So I think that was another kind of really big shift is I was like, I want to do this differently. I don't want to show up so burnout and giving, the remains of myself to people.
Yeah.
But even that is hard. It's hard to kind of make that decision, that shift, and then to maintain it, right? Because as
Yeah.
therapists, it is so easy. I mean, there's so many like societal expectations and narratives around that we're supposed to give and give and give and give and bend over backwards, and we're not supposed to ask for too much money, and
Right.
right.
Yes, exactly. Some of those there's a bit of an overlap there between some of the religious stuff and some stuff
Yeah.
for I think people who are in helping professions, whether it's nurses or teachers or therapists. Like we have these professions that it's almost like bad boundaries are part of the business. So I'm curious, what was what kind of role did like a deconstruction process or a step away from the religious upbringing you had, like, was that at college? Was that before college? Was that an ongoing process? Kind of, what did that look like where you could kind of look and see like, hey, maybe the way that I grew up wasn't so healthy?
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I had a the image that comes to my mind is like a 15-year-old Erica telling my dad, like, I don't want to go to church anymore. So I'm 15 years old, so I don't have to, right?
Sure.
I don't know
Yeah.
where I got that number. But so I think there was this aspect of like wanting to kind of rebel against this. Okay, these systems, the way things are created here in some of this religious environment is not okay.
Hmm.
Um, but kind of the way that I even think about it or even describe it now, it's almost kind of like that. If you think of like a abusive relationship, even with the church, right? Where it's like you're starting to rebel and you're starting to push back against it and to ask some of those questions, but you don't want to leave it, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
it's kind of like, well, I still need to be close, or I still am so comfortable being in this dynamic. I can't fully leave because then I'd be fully kind of abandoned, right? So I would say that there were, I don't know, maybe a good 5 to 10 years of kind of that dynamic where there was this kind of being able to really ask some of those hard questions, being able to kind of, okay, what does this mean? Um, Having a space to really explore and process and kind of that deconstruction process, being away from some of the environment, from the kind of church and religious leaders and all of that.
Sure.
It wasn't until probably about my 20s that I really was able to kind of walk on my own path and kind of have some separation and disconnection from the religion that helped me to be able to kind of restore that internal compass.
Sure. Was education like a thing that was prioritized? Like this idea that you were going to go to college, was that kind of a normal thing? Or was it like you're going to go to the Christian college that's down the street? Or like what was that kind of like?
I did get sent off to a Christian college at first.
Okay. Yeah.
And I left and I was like, I'm not doing this. And I like enrolled myself in public university,
Hmm.
which was a really good shift for me. But it's interesting because originally we kind of talked about like even this part of how in some of these really highly controlled environments, right, the education can also really be restricted,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're seeing that now in Florida, right? Um,
Yes.
but I think like even that kind of happening in that way of like, oh, you have to go to these schools or you have to get this kind of instruction, right? So a
Hmm.
big part of it, I think for me was being able to kind of have some autonomy and freedom to be able to go to institution that it's not that, right?
Yeah.
Um, so again, I think kind of like, yeah, being able to have that outside support, resources, ability to critically think,
Hmm.
that is another skill that a lot of people who are survivors of religious trauma, they don't have that skill developed of like, okay, I can critically think, I can ask some of these questions, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, I talk about this all the time, Stephen Hassan's bite model for cult control, but like thought control in organized religion is like, you don't have to think about these things. We have the answer for you. don't,
Right.
don't question it. That's bad. Just take this
Yeah.
answer, learn it, memorize it. You've got memory work. So, yeah, I think that's fascinating. I like to ask that question a lot because for me, education was highly important in my family. Both my parents are teachers, but it was always that religious school. And so for me, going to college, I went to a Big Ten university. Like that was the first time where I was like, oh, like my roommate's putting a sock on the door because he's having sex with his girlfriend. Like that's a lot for me. Like I'm this sheltered little naive, good Christian kid. So I think, but that experience for me was really helpful in the sense of like being able to just process information in my own way and hear from different people and not have to like do anything with it. Just being able to sit with it and be like, it's okay that other people are this way, and it's okay that. So that for me was, I think, super helpful. I got pulled back into the religious group after that, but college was that first like big like kind of, oh, there's a big broad world out here that I have not even scratched the surface of because I grew up in this tiny kind of bubble.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
Psychology was I was interested in psychology right away. I wanted to do therapy stuff right away. How was your schooling as far as something like private practice? Was that talked about as an option? Was that something that they mentioned briefly, or was that like, nope, like the trenches was the like preferred way, kind of that badge of honor of like, we take on all this terrible work and we're proud of it?
Yes, exactly that, actually.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I was talking to some colleagues the other day, and they were saying that there was some like kind of education about being able to start private practice and to go into it. And I was like, wow, that was not something that was part of the curriculum. And I
Yeah.
think the part of, I mean, I'm a social worker too, so there's that aspect of the background and the curriculum. But there actually was a really strong narrative that like you do not like that you're selling out to capitalism if you
Sure. Yeah.
go down that route and you do that, like you are hurting people. It was actually that strong,
Yeah.
to the point where they really tried to dissuade people from not doing that. And tried to almost kind of like butter them up, like, oh, this is going to be great. Like, you know, you're going to go out and actually help people and make changes. And I mean, in my own way, I'm actually a co-instructor at Arizona State University. And so on the side, I also like, instruct different courses in social work. So there's a part of me that still really like values that work and like, you know,
Yeah.
part of the curriculum. We still need some work, but I think it's so interesting that there is this kind of, again, it's like a restrictive, like trying to control, or things have to look a certain way, or you're not able to kind of go out and to, you know, envision the kind of agency or work that you want to do.
Yeah.
So that was something that I kind of like had to learn about and find out on my own. It was definitely not something that was talked about even among my colleagues or in the program that I was in. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is changing a little bit. Even just, I know there are podcasts that like new therapists do and talk about like getting into therapy, and like it's, so I think it's a much more broad topic now. But yeah, we had one project, I think, in grad school that was like, if you could run your own dream practice, what would it look like? And it was so like fanciful and over the top that like none of us took it seriously as like even an option. So I think it was almost this kind of like unspoken message that like, yeah, private practice is, you know, a fantasy. You're going to go work for an agency like everyone else.
Right.
So I think that is that's wild. I love hearing kind of where people are at in their careers and kind of when that, like how they get to that point of stepping away. You talked about having kids. And for me, that was a big shift as far as professional work life balance, but also I think my own like deconstruction of being like, oh, I'm not teaching my kid no on the arc. I don't believe that anymore. But like having so much of that stuff still around and like still definitely in my family. I think I'm the only person in the family who's stepped away from the church completely. And so it's one of those things that like when you see it for that next generation being like, yeah, I don't want this for that.
Mm,
But that work-life balance, I think, too, really hits. And I'm a male, so I was working while my wife was doing a lot. Well, my wife works too. It wasn't a great setup at first. But that idea of like gender roles, I think, around work-life balance is definitely different. And there's definitely some, I think, ingrained patriarchy in that process too.
hmm Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And yeah, I think it's I'm noticing too, just kind of like hearing you talk about it and some of my own story, and then like other people that I've worked with in some fashion. Like I think there is this really big generational piece to it, right? Where this kind of next generation, people are starting to really kind of walk away from religion altogether, right? I
Hmm.
think we're seeing this like in our country and culture in so many different ways. And so it's posed this whole new set of issues just around like, okay, parents or grandparents who have these ideas or philosophies that are trying to impose on the grandkids, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then you're stuck in the middle trying to like navigate and trying to create some kind of sense of autonomy or boundaries, or just a new pathway for your kids to be able to explore on their own,
Yeah.
right? So I feel like that's another like really challenging piece, that there is that kind of generational piece as well.
Yeah, and I think generational trauma too, for people whose family have been in the same religious group for a long time, that gets ingrained. And then if you're the generation who breaks the trend, trying to set healthy boundaries with people who have no idea what healthy boundaries look like, gets a lot of pushback.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that that can be messy. It'll be interesting. I'm fascinated. You mentioned this, and just sort of by happenstance, the early guests on the podcast have been heavy on religious trauma, but like it is still kind of a smaller aspect of the field. I'm watching this data and these statistics come out of people leaving the church, and I'm curious how much need there will be and how much growth there's going to be in this side of the practice for people who are stepping away, millennials and under, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think even that it's kind of being more talked about and kind of explained topic, and this is what it looks like, and this is how it can show up. I think that's really kind of started to be able to kind of support people in these different ways. But I think there's a really huge need in terms of kind of support for people who are deconstructing, who are leaving or have left, right? Because there's also this really big absence of communal support, right? So if you are a part of this, like religion for so many years of your life, there is this kind of built-in community support that is there, whether it's healthy or not, right? It's another
Right.
question. But then people who are starting to like, you know, leave in their own way or to deconstruct or whatever word you want to use, right? Not only can it cause like estrangement from the family, but also they're walking into this kind of world where they don't really have support or they don't really have people who kind of understand or are able to kind of create a new kind of culture around like, okay, we can be connected to other people. So I think that's another big thing that I'm noticing is just kind of that it's very lonely. There's like that lack of support as well.
Yeah, and I think people don't. You talked about skill set earlier. I don't know that people coming out of religious groups have the skill set to find that support, because that community, that church community, is so like ingrained. It's just they didn't work for it at all. So building new connections or finding support is a totally foreign concept to a lot of them.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think it's been wild as I've gotten into this side of the field a little bit more and got my certification and stuff like that. Done different, been guests on different YouTube shows or podcasts or whatever. Like there is kind of a phase of like the angry atheism phase when you're like first breaking off, and then like, oh, now what? Like, because for a lot of people, I think that that label of just like I'm not that religion anymore is a very limiting label, because there's then like, well, what are you instead?
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think that work is really fun and freeing, but very scary when you first when you first step
Yeah,
into that.
absolutely. I think it's a whole like identity work
Yeah,
and shifting to be able to understand who you are and what's important to you and what your needs are, right?
right. Yeah. And it's I think a loss of family is a big thing. I think for a lot of clients that I work with, and I experience this as well too, thinking that like everybody I grew up with was so nice, and then only like experience it like, oh, they were just nice as long as like I fit into this nice, neat little box. But like after I deconstructed or after I was asking questions, like not so nice anymore.
Mhm.
And I think there's like this almost kind of for a lot of people like a betrayal that happens that they have to kind of work through, and that's harm or that's trauma, maybe even little t trauma as opposed to big T trauma, but like that's another trauma on top of everything else that they are then working through.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I completely agree that betrayal piece can be a really big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then finding community, I think, is super helpful. I joke now at this point in my process to be like, the atheists I am friends with are way nicer than the Christians I ever was. But yeah, it's fascinating. So how I know lived experience was a big thing for you, but kind of how'd you decide what to study, and working with something like religious trauma or just trauma in general, you have kind of a smorgasbord of approaches that you offer for people who are dealing with that. Is that just from being in the field and seeing that different people need different things, or is this like an ongoing interest for you where you're like, oh, like that's fascinating research, let me go study that and get certified?
Yeah, I would say another big aspect of kind of issues or people I work with is also just like women's issues. And another thing that I really kind of noticed or took interest in was like the more somatic based approaches. So even in school, we're kind of taught a little bit more about kind of cognitive based approaches and like thinking our way out of things. And definitely there's a place for that and all of that. But I think what I found is as I started kind of leaning more into like the somatic based approaches, there was this kind of whole kind of bottom up approach, being able to kind of access either implicit memory, being able to help the body kind of mobilize in these different ways to process different aspects of the trauma that might be kind of held in the body in these different ways. So I would say one of the key parts of my shift and interest in that direction is I started working with, I don't know if you're familiar with Resma Minikim. He's a licensed clinical social worker, Black man who he started this organization that does education for racial equity. And he's kind of specializes it around cultural somatics. And so they have different kind of courses for people in white bodies, people in Black bodies, and bodies of culture, right? So it's like a year-long course, and you can kind of continue to do it again each year. So now I'm on like year 3 almost, or 2.5, something like that. But the really unique thing about it is that there is this like really heavy kind of cultural somatics piece to it. So you're kind of also placed into a cohort of other people. So there were 2 other people in my group. And so we would practice a lot of these like somatic pieces with each other weekly. So there was that aspect of it that I was doing for myself, and just being in a white body in society that, you know, we live in this kind of white supremacist environment. So that was like a big part of like the foundation piece. And then kind of stemming from that and some of my own interests, and I also went and got trained in somatic attachment therapy, which again, that, and then also internal family systems, which also really just kind of looks at the body, different sensations that may come up in the body. Like an example I like to use is, you know, if somebody's talking about their mom and they start like clenching their jaw, or they start like holding their breath. So that might be something that I might kind of slow them down. That's information, right? So we might just kind of be aware of what's happening for them in their body, to be able to kind of integrate some of that material. So it's just a little bit different way of kind of working through whatever it is, whether it's trauma or even just kind of unprocessed emotions or grief and loss. Like there's a lot of things that we go through that can actually be kind of stored and held in the body. So
yeah, for sure. I think the more that I have worked in the area of trauma, the more like body work I end up keep adding and tacking on. And I approach it a little bit backwards from, I have a sports background as well. So I've done coaching and done mental wellness for student athletes. And so like I was really big on yoga just for the health benefits and the mind body connection. And then when I got certified in religious trauma, being like, oh yeah, like there's all this overlap in this body stuff that makes sense for someone who's had a physical injury versus somebody who's had a emotional injury or a mental injury. Like the body and the brain process them pretty similarly. And so being able to like practice a lot of those things in a different context, I know for me, it was eye-opening to just get more and more tools, because I did a lot of breath work with people and being like, oh, right, for somebody who had to hold their breath because their parent was unsafe, or somebody who had, you know, a situation where holding their breath was a survival tactic, like that isn't a good tool for that person in processing their trauma. So like, I think learning all these different ways to process it, both mentally and physically, because yeah, I would agree. My training was heavy on the intellectualization of mental health, and kind of like I write about it a lot, taking the brain out of the body, which doesn't make any sense because the brain is a body part. So we can't help the brain if we're not dealing with the body stuff too.
yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think even just for me, like being a therapist, having my own kind of foundation or practice of being able to use some of these somatic practices, right? Like obviously when we work with clients, right, we also have to have kind of our own practice around like, okay, how am I going to help kind of teach myself to let go or to release, or to be able to not hold in everything that we're, processing and talking about. Because I think, yeah, I mean, as therapists, we're naturally very like empathetic and we're very attuned, right?
Yeah.
And so
Right.
I think it does require a lot of like attention to be able to kind of develop some of these practices that help our body get the signal of like, okay, I can let go, I can
Yeah.
release, right? I can take a break, or I can mobilize and have some movement to get outside. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think I look back, young Jeremy did, 7 or 8 clients a day, back to back to back, no breaks in between, never taking a lunch break, like all that stuff. And it's so wild, like thinking of the way I run my practice now, where like I have breaks, I take lunch, I try and take lunch outside. Like there's so much more of like, I can do better work if I'm invested in myself, as opposed to kind of this like just like nose to the grind of like, I'm going to smash as many sessions as I can into a day to help as many people as possible. I mean, like, I don't know that like 9th session of the day was all that good.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate. I think it's like, yeah, it's kind of like getting to that place where you kind of rub up against your own kind of limitations and our own boundaries, right? That kind of allow us to like, okay, wait a minute, this doesn't feel good or this isn't working, right? To have to be able to kind of re-envision that. But yeah, I can totally relate. I've been there as well. So yeah.
So yeah, now running my own practice, like I have a day where I don't see clients, and
Yeah.
like whether I use it to catch up on paperwork or I want to go to do something with my boys. I have 2 young boys. Or if we're, some days it's just me and I'm like going to go out on the river because I need to just kind of unplug and like do my own mental health and wellness check. But like that's been really totally different than how I've ever practiced before. It's always been like, where can I fit people in and how can I offer hours that work for people? And it's never been like, nope, this is my day where I don't have clients. So I think that's really wild then to see like, oh yeah, duh. Like I probably knew that intellectually, but was not putting it into practice.
Yeah, I think similar for me as well. Like I structure my day, like my hours are between 9 and 2, and I'm done by 2 p.m. Right. So when my
Yeah.
kids get to school, I can really just kind of shift gears and put on my mom hat and be there for them. And I think that is such a major shift for me that makes me in such a better mentally and emotional space, right? To be able to, okay, these are my work hours and I'm done, right? And now I can shift
Yeah.
gears. In the past, it was like the last job that comes to my mind, I was the director of a residential facility, and it was just like really long hours, or I was like always on call during the week. And then on the weekend, I was also on call. And since it was like an overnight facility, I was also on call. Right?
Yeah.
So it was just kind of like your brain and your body in some ways always kind of on, right? So being able to like have that ability to actually turn it off, right? Or to actually not be working, I think that's such a major shift. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Going off of that a little bit, what is your kind of self-care practice? What's like wellness for you look like at this point in your career? Like obviously that work-life balance is a lot different and healthier, it sounds like, but what do you do kind of actively to invest in your mental well-being?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's something that's always evolving and changing, right? And I think even that aspect of allowing it to always evolve and change and moving away from rigidity has been really healing for me, right? That it doesn't have to look like, okay, every day I'm going to do this, right? Or I have to do this. And if I don't do this, this is an indicator that I'm not healthy. Um, so it's a lot more kind of fluid. I think for me, like walking in between sessions has been a really big thing for me to be able to kind of get up and mobilize and to have some kind of movement. Getting outdoors, like going to the beach, is another thing that is very connecting in nature. I think
Yeah.
that is very soothing, just to be able to kind of have that space where I can get away from everything and I can just go sit and be still.
Yeah.
And then also simple things like just getting out and going for a coffee with a friend, or something that's just very simple, but just the act of like being able to sit down and have some connection with somebody, that's something that I really prioritize, because it just makes such a difference to be able to have that space where I'm like, okay, I get to go out, meet with a friend or a colleague or something like that.
Yeah.
So those are like the main ones that I have more on like a rhythm or routine. And then some of like the somatic work that I do. So even just like the rocking, the swaying, like other parts of it are like the humming, the singing, listening to music. Those things are things that really kind of help with my nervous system and being able to kind of
Yeah.
regulate and all of that. And then I would say like traveling is another big thing for me that I really enjoy. So that's obviously something that has to be like scheduled in, right?
Right.
With time.
Yeah.
But that ability to like explore and to get up and to go somewhere, I think is another big part of like self-care for me.
Yeah. For sure. What's on your bookshelf? What are you reading? What are you what's the thing that's taking up the interest in your mind right now?
Yeah, so I just got No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz,
Mm-hmm.
so from the Internal Family Systems model. So I'm really excited. That's one that I'm going to be reading pretty soon. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Very cool. Yes, we had, I don't want to say a whole episode on IFS, but one of the other therapists I interviewed talked pretty extensively about internal family system, both the work that he did and also now doing it as a therapist. It's a fascinating therapeutic approach, I think. You talked about listening to music. I'm a music fan myself. I have ADHD, and so pretty much all the time there's music on, because that background stimulation really helps to kind of slow my other brain processes down. What do you like to listen to? What's been your jam recently?
Yeah. So right now I'm listening to Japanese Breakfast. Sure if you
Sure.
heard of
Yep.
it. Yeah. I really like some of the lyrical component of that. So that's one that's like, on my rotation. I have other ones that I'm kind of like an indie fan.
Yeah.
I like some like underground music. Cleo Soul's another one, where I like to find just kind of like more kind of like hidden artists that
Yeah.
really catch me either with lyrics or tune. So I'm always kind of like on a hunt for
Sure.
music. But yeah, those are two just off the top of my head that I like.
Yeah. Do you use music in session at all?
I don't really, but I'm totally not against it. I've used it in like a term of kind of like background noise or soothing.
Yeah.
When I worked with kids, it was something that we used a lot, right? To
Sure.
be able to
Right.
kind of, oh, let's talk about this song and the lyrics and what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
No longer working with kids, so I don't use it as much. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I have it on all the time just for my own mental well-being. But it's a thing that I think is fascinating, because I think art especially is a way to kind of like let people open up. They can talk about some of these heavier things, or this song, or this still shot from a movie, or the scene in a movie really encapsulates how they feel about it. So I like to talk about stuff like that, even if I don't use it kind of as a technique anymore. Very cool. What if people are kind of looking for your information, the work that you're doing, where can they find you? How do they learn more?
Sure. So I provide telehealth and virtual services in the state of California. So anywhere in the state of California. My website is www.sunsettraumatherapy.com. So they can also Google Sunset Trauma Therapy, or my name is Erica Lima, licensed clinical social worker. But probably my website is probably the easiest way to find me, to get in touch with me.
Sure.
I offer 15-minute free consultations for anybody who's going to be open or interested for therapy. So
Yeah. And you're from the East Coast, but now reside on the West Coast,
yeah. Yes, that is correct.
which ocean is better? What's the preference for beaches?
And I was also in New York, so I was trying to hit all the big cities.
Sure.
I mean, the scenic out here is incredible, right? With the mountains, the Pacific. So I think I'm gonna have to side with the Pacific. So yeah.
Sure. Very cool. Well, Erica, it has been awesome having you on. Thanks so much for joining today.
Yeah, I really appreciate talking with you, Jeremy. Thanks for connecting.
Yeah, and you can find all of Erica's stuff. We'll have all her links and website in the show notes. I'm Jeremy. You can find all my information at my website, wellnesswithjared.com. And we will be back next week with another episode. Take care, everyone.